In 1841 Alabama, the nights were heavy and quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed down on the fields like a weight, thick with the smell of cotton, smoke, and secrets. The Lockwood Plantation stood alone on the hill, its white pillars glowing faintly under the moonlight, its windows burning with the dim gold of oil lanterns. It was a place that looked peaceful from a distance, but up close the silence was sharp enough to cut. The house belonged to widow Mary Ann Lockwood, a woman whose name made men lower their voices and women look away. She was beautiful in a way that frightened people. Her smile was soft, but it never reached her eyes. And when she spoke, people listened like they didn't have a choice. The slaves on the plantation worked under the brutal sun every day, but nights like this were different. Whispers moved through the quarters like a slow wind, reaching every ear but spoken by none too loud. The widow had sent word. She wanted one man brought to the house. One man, and no one knew why. She called it a reward, but everyone knew the widow never did anything out of kindness. She didn't give, she took. And every gift she offered carried something dark behind it. Elijah had been chosen. He was young, strong, with hands hardened from years in the fields. He had never been inside the big house, not like this. He had seen the others who went before him. They never came back the same. Some returned quiet, eyes hollow. Some disappeared without a trace. But when the overseer came for him that night, holding a lantern and saying her name in that low voice, Elijah didn't resist. No one could refuse her. The moon hung low as they led him up the path, his bare feet brushing against the gravel, the mansion rising taller with each step. The house didn't just stand on the hill. It stared down at everything below it. Its white paint gleamed in the pale light, but its windows were black, like eyes that had seen too much and said nothing. The door opened before they reached it. It always did. The butler, an old man with a face carved from stone, took him by the arm. His hands were cold. "She's waiting," he whispered, and his voice cracked just a little. That was the only warning Elijah got. He was led through the hall past portraits of pale men and women in fine clothes. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him, their frozen smiles pulling tighter the deeper he went. The floor creaked beneath his feet, but the air was still. He could hear the sound of the clock ticking somewhere above them. He could hear his own breath. He could hear his heart, heavy and slow. The house smelled of roses and something else underneath. Something old, something like a locked-up room that hadn't seen light in years. The staircase was wide and curved, the railing smooth like bone. The butler guided him up without a word, and halfway up, Elijah felt the weight in the air change. It pressed on his chest. The lanterns burned lower here. The silence grew thicker. At the top of the stairs was a long hallway, lined with closed doors, each one the same. But Elijah's eyes stopped on the one at the very end. It was half open, a soft golden light spilling out. The butler let go of his arm and whispered, "Go." And then he turned and left without looking back. Elijah walked down the hallway alone. The wooden floor groaned under his weight like it didn't want him there. The air was cold. His shadow stretched ahead of him, thin and shaky. When he reached the door, it opened wider without him touching it, and inside she was waiting. Widow Mary Ann Lockwood. She stood near the bed, dressed in black silk that shimmered faintly in the lamplight. Her hair was pinned high, her neck pale against the dark fabric. In her hand was a single candle. The light flickered across her face, softening nothing. Her eyes were dark, steady, and sharp. She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind that hides something behind it. "Elijah," she whispered, like she'd been saying his name for a long time. He didn't answer. He couldn't, his throat was tight. She motioned for him to come in. He stepped forward. The door closed behind him without a sound. The room was unlike anything Elijah had ever seen. Heavy velvet curtains hung over the windows, swallowing the night. A large mirror faced the bed, its surface reflecting the candlelight in strange, shifting ways. There were no family portraits here, no signs of life, only her and the bed. She moved toward him slowly, the silk of her dress whispering against the floor. "You've worked hard for me," she said, her voice smooth, almost soft. "Tonight you will be rewarded." But there was something in the way she said reward that made it sound less like a gift and more like a trap. Elijah nodded stiffly. He had no choice. On this land, no one said no to her. She stepped close enough that he could smell her perfume, jasmine and something darker. something like iron. She touched his chest lightly with her fingers, and for a second, everything was quiet except for the sound of the candle flame trembling. Then in that silence, Elijah heard something else. A sound too soft to be real. A whisper. Not hers, not his. It came from somewhere in the room. Low and careful, like it was trying not to be heard. The widow didn't react to the sound. She acted like it wasn't there. But Elijah felt it. It slid down his spine like cold water. His hands curled into fists. The floor beneath him didn't feel solid anymore. It felt alive. She smiled wider, and for the first time Elijah saw something in her eyes. Not warmth, not hunger. Something else. Something wrong. She took the candle and placed it on the nightstand. The flame bent as if the air in the room had shifted. Her voice dropped lower. "Do you know why I chose you?" she whispered. He shook his head slowly. She leaned closer, her breath cold against his ear. "Because the house wants you." Elijah froze. She stepped away and the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the walls. For the people outside in the quarters, the night was quiet. But inside the widow's room, the night was anything but. The house was awake. And it had chosen. No one on the plantation ever saw Elijah the same way again. Some said he was lucky. Some said cursed. But no one knew the truth, not yet. The widow had offered her reward, and the house had opened its mouth. The night air outside the Lockwood house was heavy and still, thick with the damp scent of wet soil and cotton stalks, the kind of silence that made people keep their heads down and their whispers quiet. Back in the slave quarters, no one slept. They lay on their rough wooden bunks staring at the roof beams, listening to the faraway creak of the big house, that sound that always meant something was happening behind its closed doors. The word had spread fast through the quarters before sundown. The widow had sent for Elijah. And everyone knew what that meant. Some men turned away and muttered prayers under their breath. Some women crossed themselves and touched the charms they kept hidden in their palms. No one spoke his name too loud. On that land, being chosen by the widow was not a gift. It was a sentence whispered in velvet. Elijah sat alone in the small washroom behind the stables, stripped down to his skin as one of the house servants poured water over his shoulders. The water was cold and it slid down his back like a shiver he couldn't shake off. They'd handed him clean clothes, a plain white shirt, dark trousers, shoes he'd never worn before. They were soft, almost too soft, like they didn't belong to him. He kept his eyes down as the butler combed his hair and straightened his collar, the way they did for men who belonged to the house, not the fields. He felt the walls of the room closing in. He could smell the rosewater they had rubbed into his skin, sweet and strange. A smell that didn't belong to him either. When they led him up the path toward the mansion, the lanterns along the walkway burned low in gold, their light flickering against the branches of the old oak trees. Elijah's shadow stretched ahead of him like something trying to escape. The overseer said nothing. He just walked behind him, close enough that Elijah could hear his boots crushing the gravel. Every step closer to the house felt like a door closing behind him. The house stood tall against the moonlight, its pillars white and smooth, its windows dark except for one at the top, where a single light burned like a waiting eye. The butler opened the front door without knocking, like the house already knew Elijah was coming. Inside, the hall smelled of beeswax, old wood, and the faint iron scent that always lingered in the big house at night. The walls held portraits of the Lockwood family, pale faces, dark eyes, smiles that never quite reached their painted lips. The butler led Elijah through the main hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet like quiet warnings. The grandfather clock at the end of the corridor ticked too loud in the silence. Elijah counted every step, every breath, every heartbeat. He'd worked this land since he was old enough to hold a hoe, but this house was different at night. It didn't feel like it belonged to people. It felt like it belonged to something else. They stopped at the base of the grand staircase. The butler didn't look at him when he said, "She's waiting upstairs." His voice was flat, but Elijah caught the faint tremor at the edge of it. The man turned away quickly, as if even standing too close to this moment could pull him into whatever was coming. Elijah climbed the stairs alone. The hallway upstairs was lined with doors, each one closed tight. Only the last door at the end of the hall was half open, leaking out that same golden light that flickered against the walls. His footsteps echoed against the wood, louder than they should have. The door swung wider when he approached, though he didn't touch it. She was waiting inside. Widow Mary Ann Lockwood. She stood near the edge of her bed, the same black silk dress clinging to her as if it were part of her skin. Her pale throat caught the glow of the lantern. Her dark hair fell loose down her back, and those eyes, the ones that made strong men flinch, were fixed on Elijah. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She just watched him the way a hunter watches a deer. "Come in," she said softly, but her voice didn't sound like a request. It slid through the air like a silk rope tightening. Elijah stepped in because there was no other choice. The door closed behind him without anyone touching it. Inside, the air was cooler, but it wasn't the kind of cool that refreshed. It crept under his skin like damp fog. The curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the moon. Only a few candles lit the room, their flames bending strangely as if they were breathing the same air he was. On the wall above the fireplace hung a portrait of her late husband, his painted eyes dark, almost watchful. She walked toward him slowly, her silk dress whispering against the floor like it was alive. Her perfume wrapped around him, sweet jasmine mixed with something sharp and metallic. "You've worked hard for me," she said softly, tracing a finger along the air between them. "This is your reward." The way she said reward made his stomach twist. Her pale hand reached out, not rough, not kind either, just deliberate. She touched his chest with cold fingers. Elijah didn't breathe. Behind her, the candle flames shivered again, though there was no wind. Her smile didn't change, but something in her eyes did. A spark of hunger that wasn't human. From the walls came a sound so soft Elijah almost thought he imagined it. A whisper, faint and distant, like someone speaking through a crack in the world. Her expression didn't shift. She pretended she didn't hear it, but he did. It slid along his spine, thin as a blade. She circled him like a predator, slow and soundless, her fingertips grazing the fabric of his shirt. He didn't move. He couldn't. Her voice dropped lower. "Do you know why I chose you?" she whispered, leaning close enough that her breath brushed his ear. He shook his head once. Her lips curled. "Because you're strong, and the house likes the strong ones best." The house. Not her, the house. The words made something cold settle in his chest. He turned slightly, and for the first time, he noticed the mirror on the far wall, tall and gold-framed. But what it reflected wasn't right. It showed the room, the bed, the candles, but her reflection didn't stand where she was. It stood closer to him. She smiled wider when she saw his eyes flick to the glass. "You feel it too, don't you?" she whispered. "It's awake tonight." The whispering from the walls grew louder now, still soft but layered like more than one voice. The sound had no clear words, only rhythm. It was like the house was breathing with them, waiting. Elijah's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. She guided him closer to the bed, her hand never leaving his chest. The air grew colder with each step. The closer they got, the more the room seemed to stretch around them as if the walls weren't made of wood anymore but something alive. The candlelight dimmed even though the flames burned the same. Down below in the slave quarters, someone woke suddenly, heart pounding, as if they'd heard something carried through the ground. The dogs outside the house began to whine. In the widow's room, Elijah stood at the edge of the bed, his breath shallow, the whispering now wrapped around the edges of his thoughts. The widow tilted her head slightly, the candlelight catching on her eyes. "Don't be afraid," she said softly. But her smile said something else entirely. She leaned closer until her lips brushed his ear again. "The house has already chosen you." The mirror behind her pulsed like a heartbeat, and the whispering turned into a low hum that made the floor vibrate beneath his feet. Elijah closed his eyes for just a second, and in that second the room stopped feeling like a room. It felt like a mouth, and he was already standing inside it. The door to the widow's room clicked shut behind Elijah with a soft thud that sounded too final, like the sound a coffin lid might make when it closes for the last time. The air in the room grew still, pressing down on his chest like heavy hands. The candles flickered, but their light didn't warm the space. It only painted the walls in trembling gold and shadow, and every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far, as if it wanted to reach him. The widow stood near the edge of her bed, still wearing that black silk dress that caught the light and gave nothing back. Her pale skin shining faintly under the candle glow, her dark eyes locked on Elijah like a snake watching something that can't escape. "Take off your shoes," she whispered, her voice quiet but sharp enough to slice the silence. It wasn't a request, it was a command wrapped in silk. Elijah hesitated for only a heartbeat, then obeyed, his hands moving slow, his breath catching somewhere in his throat. His bare feet touched the wooden floor, and it felt colder than it should have, like the chill had been waiting for him. Like it knew he was coming. She stepped closer, her perfume surrounding him again. That same sweet jasmine mixed with something metallic and sour, something he couldn't name. She tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when she wanted something. But this time it wasn't desire in her eyes. It was something older, something hungrier. She lifted her hand and touched his jaw lightly, and her fingers were colder than the floor. "You're trembling," she whispered. And the way she said it made it sound like she liked it, like fear was part of the reward. Elijah didn't speak. He wasn't sure he could. His throat felt dry, his heartbeat steady but heavy, echoing against the walls of his chest like footsteps down a hallway with no end. The widow stepped behind him slowly, her silk dress whispering against the floor, and when she moved, the whispering in the walls began again, faint, distant, like 100 dry voices breathing in the dark. Elijah's eyes moved toward the mirror without meaning to. It hung on the far wall, tall, framed in gold. And something was wrong with it, something small but sharp. The reflection didn't match the room. The shadows in the glass moved slower than the ones behind him, and when the widow stepped behind him, her reflection didn't follow. It stood where it was, smiling faintly as if it was something separate from her, as if it was waiting. She leaned close to his ear, her breath cold as river water. "This house was built on blood," she whispered. Slow, careful, like every word was meant to be carved into him. "And it always remembers." The whispering in the walls grew louder, still soft but clearer now, layered like more than one voice, whispering the same rhythm over and over. Elijah's skin prickled. The hair on the back of his neck stood straight. Something deep in his chest screamed to run, to turn, to break through the door, but his feet wouldn't move. His body locked in place as if the house itself had wrapped invisible ropes around him. The widow walked around him slowly, circling him like a predator that had already caught its prey, the candlelight glinting against her eyes as she spoke softly. "Every man who stands where you stand becomes part of the house," she said. Almost like a prayer they gave themselves. "And the house remembers." Elijah's breath came faster now. Short and sharp, he wanted to speak, but his mouth felt heavy. The room seemed to hum softly, not just from the walls now, but from the floor beneath his feet, as if something beneath the house was stirring, breathing with them. She reached for his hands and guided them toward the mirror, her fingers cold and firm, forcing his palms against the glass. The mirror was colder than ice. A shiver ran through him so hard his knees nearly buckled. But worse than the cold was the pulse. There was a pulse inside the glass, faint but real, beating against his hands like something alive on the other side. The widow's voice softened, but it wasn't gentle. It was reverent. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. He nodded without meaning to. "Good," she said. "It feels you too." The whispers in the walls slid closer now. No longer distant, they came from behind the mirror, from the floorboards, from the cracks in the walls, voices without bodies, sounds that didn't belong to anything human. The mirror darkened slowly, the reflection of the room dimming like smoke rolling over water. The faces of the portraits on the walls behind him disappeared into the dark, replaced by faint outlines, shapes, something moving in the glass. His heart pounded against his ribs, loud enough that it almost drowned out the whispering. Almost. The widow stepped behind him again, her hands sliding onto his shoulders, her nails pressing into his skin through the fabric of his shirt. Her voice was lower now, slower. A chant more than a whisper. "The house gives," she breathed into his ear, "but only after it takes." Elijah stared at the mirror. At first he saw only his own reflection, pale and shaking. Then it changed. Another shape stood beside him in the glass, tall and thin, its face blurred, its eyes black hollows. The shape tilted its head the same way the widow did. Elijah blinked, but it didn't go away. It got closer. The candlelight in the room flickered violently. The window shutters banged against the frame, though there was no wind. The whispering became a low, endless hum. Elijah's breathing turned ragged, his hand still pressed against the mirror, trapped. The thing inside the glass moved closer to his reflection until it stood behind him. But when he turned, there was nothing there. Only the widow's hands, cold as the grave. She leaned forward until her lips brushed his ear again. "Now it knows you," she whispered, and there was a small shudder in her voice like the house itself had taken a deep breath. "Now you belong to it." He yanked his hands away from the mirror and stumbled back, but the room didn't feel the same anymore. The walls seemed to lean in closer, the ceiling lower, the floor breathing under his feet. The widow watched him calmly, her head tilted slightly, her eyes too dark. "There's no way out," she said softly, like it was a fact, not a threat. "There never is." Outside, the wind finally rose, the old oak trees around the house bending against it. But inside the room, the air didn't move. It pressed down harder. Elijah's chest tightened. For the first time in his life, he understood why no man who entered this room ever came out the same. Because the house didn't just have secrets. The house had a hunger, and it had just chosen him. The mirror was still pulsing when the sound changed. The soft whispers that had slithered through the walls now grew sharper. Like nails scraping across wood, the air thickened. The floor beneath Elijah's bare feet felt damp and cold, as though the house had pulled water from the earth itself. The candles trembled and their flames bent inward as if something was breathing in the room, not with them, but around them, pulling the air out piece by piece, leaving only a hollow silence behind. The widow stood still, not moving, not blinking, her eyes fixed on the mirror with a calm that didn't belong to the living. Elijah's heart thudded in his chest, a heavy, slow rhythm that echoed against his ribs. But even that sound felt swallowed, like it was being listened to, like something in the walls was learning it, memorizing it. His hands still tingled from where they'd touched the mirror, cold biting through the bones as if the glass had left its fingerprints on him instead of the other way around. The widow tilted her head slightly, the silk of her dress shifting like water, and whispered softly, "The house knows your heartbeat now." He stepped back, his heel hitting the edge of the rug. But the room didn't get any bigger. It felt smaller, narrower, like the walls had leaned in without making a sound. His eyes flicked to the door, still closed, though he hadn't heard it lock. The doorknob gleamed faintly in the candlelight, but it felt too far away, as if every step toward it would only make it further. The widow turned toward him slowly, her pale hands gliding down the sides of her dress, her movements too smooth, too quiet. "Do you hear it?" she whispered, and she didn't mean her voice. Elijah held his breath, and in that breathless space he heard it. Something beneath the floorboards, something crawling slow, dragging itself like wet cloth through the belly of the house. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't wind. It was the sound of something that had been here long before him, long before her. Her smile grew wider, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes because it didn't need to. She didn't move closer to him. She didn't have to. The room was already doing that for her. "This house is older than me," she said softly. "Older than this land. It doesn't let go of what it wants." The shadows on the wall moved even though the candles did not. Elijah's chest rose and fell faster, the sound of his breath louder now, sharper, cutting through the silence like a blade. But the house didn't seem to care. The whispering climbed higher, circling him from all sides like invisible fingers dragging across his skin. He lunged toward the door. The sound of his feet on the wood was muffled, as if the floor was trying to keep him quiet. His hand closed around the brass knob, cold and slick. He twisted. It didn't move. He pulled harder, his shoulders straining, but it was like trying to move the roots of a tree. The widow didn't stop him. She just watched. Her head tilted a little further. "You can't leave," she said simply, "not while it's still hungry." The mirror cracked softly behind him, a thin line splitting the glass from top to bottom with a sound like bones snapping under weight. He froze. Something in the air shifted. It wasn't just cold now. It was alive. Heavy breaths filled the room, not from him, not from her, from somewhere else. He turned slowly toward the sound. The mirror was no longer just a mirror. The darkness on its surface rippled like black water. Fingers, thin, long, and wrong, pressed against the inside of the glass, bending it outward like skin stretched too tight. Then another hand. And another. The widow whispered something in a language he didn't know, soft and steady, like a lullaby for something that should never have been born. The thing in the mirror moved closer to the surface, and the whispering in the room became a low, guttural sound rising from the floor, from the walls, from everywhere. Elijah stumbled backward, his back hitting the locked door, his breath sharp and shallow. The widow's silk dress whispered as she glided toward the mirror, her hand reaching out slowly, tenderly, as if greeting an old friend. "This is your night," she murmured. "This is the price." The fingers inside the mirror clawed down the glass, leaving trails like ink bleeding through water. A shape pressed against the surface now, tall, thin, faceless, a thing without a name. The sound it made wasn't human, it wasn't even alive, it was the sound of the earth splitting, of old things waking up. Elijah slammed his shoulder against the door. It didn't move. She turned her head toward him without moving the rest of her body, her smile wide and sharp. No one ever runs far. The house always brings them back, the mirror groaned. The first finger broke through. The glass didn't shatter, it melted around it, like it had been waiting to let it through. A wet, cold draft spread across the room, crawling up Elijah's legs like hands made of mist. He gasped, his breath fogging in the air, though there was no winter outside. The widow whispered again, louder this time, and the thing behind the glass answered, not with words, but with a sound that made the candles flicker and the floor tremble. Elijah twisted the doorknob again, every muscle in his arms straining. It moved half an inch, then stopped. Something on the other side was holding it shut. Slowly, quietly. He wasn't alone on that side either. The widow reached the mirror, pressing her hand flat against the surface. It welcomed her. The fingers wrapped around hers like old lovers. Her eyes closed as she whispered, "It remembers you." Elijah pressed his forehead against the door, his breath coming in sharp gasps, the cold now crawling up his spine. His reflection in the mirror wasn't moving anymore. It stood frozen even though he was still fighting the door. The mirror, Elijah smiled. That was the moment he understood. The house wasn't just watching. It was choosing. The widow opened her eyes again. "It's time," she said softly, like a mother calling a child to bed. And the mirror cracked wider, spilling blackness across the floor like ink. Outside the house, the field slept under the moon, silent and still, the same way they always did. But inside, the Lockwood plantation was awake, and it was hungry. The blackness bled from the mirror like smoke and oil mixed together, thick and slow, spreading across the polished floorboards as if it had weight. As if it were alive, the room no longer felt like a room. It felt like the inside of something breathing, something that didn't need light to see or walls to contain it. Elijah pressed his back against the door, his palms slick with sweat, his breath hard and shallow. But the door wouldn't budge. The brass knob felt colder than iron, almost burning his skin, like the house itself was holding him in place. The widow moved closer to the mirror, her black silk dress whispering over the floor like water sliding over stone. And when the blackness touched the hem of her gown, she didn't flinch, she didn't step back. She just smiled, that small, hollow smile, the kind that doesn't come from joy but from knowing what comes next. The thing behind the mirror was almost free now. It pressed its hands, its arms, its thin twisted shape against the glass. The sound of its nails scraping against the surface rattled through the room like a blade against bone. The glass stretched, bent, then rippled like skin. And the whispering returned, no longer faint, no longer distant. It filled the room, layered with so many voices that Elijah couldn't tell where one ended and another began. The walls shook softly. The candle flames bent flat. The house wasn't just watching anymore. It was calling. The widow's voice cut through the sound like a knife through silk. "Do you know," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the mirror, "how long this house has waited for someone strong enough to feed it?" Her words were soft, calm, too calm, the way a person might talk to a child before putting them to bed. Elijah's heart slammed against his ribs. He pulled harder at the door, his shoulder straining, his breath turning to steam in the freezing air. But the door was no longer just wood. It felt like part of the house, like bone. The mirror gave a long, wet crack. A shape stepped through. It wasn't a person, not even a shadow. It was something that moved like smoke and flesh at the same time, its form bending, stretching, folding over itself as it slid out of the glass and into the golden light of the candles, which flickered weakly like dying stars. The blackness followed it like a cloak. It didn't walk, it flowed. The room itself seemed to lean toward it. Elijah's throat went dry. His body wanted to scream, but the air was too thick. He pressed his fists against the door, pounding now, wood against bone. But the house didn't let go. The widow turned her head toward him slowly, her face almost glowing in the sickly gold light. "You should not fight it," she said softly. "The house never loses." The thing twisted its head, or what passed for a head, toward him. It had no eyes, no face, but somehow he knew it was looking at him. It tilted its head the same way she always did. It made a sound, not a growl, not a roar, but a low, steady hum that vibrated through his bones. the kind of sound that makes your stomach twist like you're falling through darkness. The widow raised her hands like a priestess leading a prayer. "It remembers the blood," she whispered. "It remembers the field. It remembers the fire. And tonight it will feed." The black smoke slid closer to Elijah, crawling over the floor like fingers dragging across cold water. He felt it touch his ankle, ice cold, sharp like frost-biting skin. He kicked against it, but it moved like liquid, curling around his leg, climbing higher, wrapping tight like a serpent with no shape. The whispering grew louder, words hidden in the layers, old and cracked like wood in winter. Some of them in languages he didn't know, some in a voice that sounded almost like his own. The widow walked toward him, slow and unhurried, her feet not making a sound against the boards. She didn't need to force him. The house was already doing that. She crouched slightly, her pale hand lifting his chin with a finger colder than the mirror, her black silk dripping with the smoke like she was part of it. "This is what happens to the chosen," she whispered against his ear. "You don't leave this house. You become it." He jerked away, pushing her hand off with a force that surprised even himself. His shoulder slammed the door one more time, and for a moment, a single, fragile moment, it gave a sound, a groan, like the house itself didn't like being challenged. His breath caught. He shoved again. The widow's smile twitched just a little. "Oh," she said softly, "you're going to make it fight for you. Good." The smoke climbed up his legs, wrapping around his waist like wet ropes tightening. He gasped, his vision trembling. The shape from the mirror drifted closer, its arms bending and snapping like they weren't made for this world. When it moved, the room bent with it. The candles bending, the portraits shaking on the walls without falling. The house was alive, and hungry. The widow reached for him again, but this time Elijah grabbed her wrist, her skin cold like river ice, her pulse slow, almost not there at all. For the first time, her smile faded. A crack, just a hairline crack in her mask. But the house did not care. The smoke slammed against his chest like a wave, pushing him back, pinning him against the door. His breath tore from him. He could hear the sound of his own heart, and it wasn't alone anymore. There was another beat beneath it, lower, older, like the house had a heart of its own, and now it was trying to match his. The thing reached him, its hands, or what passed for hands, sliding around his shoulders like water and claws all at once. He felt it digging into him without touching skin, pulling something deeper, something that wasn't flesh. The widow stood beside it, her eyes wide and full of something close to reverence. "Let it in," she whispered, "or it will take you screaming." Elijah did scream then, but the sound didn't leave the room. It died in the air, eaten by the house before it could hit the walls. His scream was nothing here. The mirror pulsed behind the creature, every crack on its surface glowing faintly like veins of gold in black stone. The whispers changed. They started to say his name, over and over, in every voice that had ever been swallowed by this house. The black smoke dragged him down to his knees, the cold cutting into his bones. He tried to claw at it, but his hands passed through, leaving nothing but numbness behind. His head spun. He didn't know if it was the air or the house itself pulling him under. The widow leaned close to his ear one last time. "The house always gets what it wants," she said softly. And for the first time, Elijah saw her for what she was. Not a woman, not just the widow, but something bound to this place, something that belonged to the darkness inside the walls. The thing pulled him closer, and the room seemed to fold in on itself, the air twisting like cloth in water. The portraits on the walls blurred. The clock downstairs stopped ticking, and Elijah's heartbeat was no longer his alone. It was part of the house now. Outside, the fields of Alabama slept quietly under the pale moon, the plantation looking calm, peaceful, like nothing had happened. But inside the house, the darkness finally wrapped itself around its chosen prey, the whispers fading into one single breath. The house had fed again. The house didn't roar. It didn't shout, it breathed slow and deep. The way something old and patient breathes after waiting a long time. The black smoke swallowed Elijah whole, wrapping around him like cold fingers pressing against every inch of his skin. Sinking through cloth, bone, breath, it didn't just hold him, it sank into him. The air itself felt like it was thickening inside his chest, every inhale dragging something sharp and heavy through his lungs. The room pulsed in time with his heartbeat, or maybe it was the other way around now. Maybe his heart was beating with the house's rhythm, slow, endless, ancient. The widow didn't move fast. She never did. She moved like someone who already knew how the story ended. the silk of her black dress brushing the floor like a shadow, with a heartbeat of its own, her pale hands hovering above Elijah as if she were conducting a ritual she had done many times before. Her lips moved, but no words came out, only that soft low hum, the same one the house made, the same one the creature from the mirror carried inside it like a pulse. The hum crawled into Elijah's ears, down his spine, settling deep inside the part of him that still hoped to fight. The mirror behind her was alive now, the cracks pulsing with soft golden veins that twisted like roots of a tree. The shape that had emerged fully from the glass no longer looked like a shadow. It was solid now, taller than any man, its body thin and stretched, its arms too long, its face still nothing but a smooth pale surface that reflected faint light like wet stone. Its presence made the air shake, not with sound but with weight. Elijah felt it inside his bones, inside the part of him that belonged to fear, the part that knew this was not something meant to exist in any world men had built. He tried to scream again, but the sound never made it past his throat. The smoke coiled tighter, climbing around his ribs, his neck, his jaw. It didn't choke him the way hands would. It drowned him slowly, pressing down on his breath, crushing the will out of him piece by piece. The widow leaned down until her face was close to his, her eyes black as the space inside a grave, and whispered softly, "Don't fight it. It doesn't like it when they fight." The creature moved closer. It didn't walk, it slid. The air around it bent and shook. The candles near the bed went out without sound, leaving only the low gold pulse of the mirror cracks to light the room. Elijah's fingers dug into the floorboards, splinters breaking beneath his nails, his body shaking but still trapped. The smoke wasn't just outside him anymore. It was under his skin. His veins burned with cold fire. His heartbeat slowed. One beat, then another. Then another. The widow reached out to touch the creature's arm. Her hand didn't sink into the smoke. It was welcomed, like she had always belonged to it. She tilted her head, her voice soft and low like silk dragged over wood. "Do you hear them, Elijah?" she whispered.
All the others who tried to run?
They live in its walls now. They breathe when it breathes. They whisper when it sleeps. And then Elijah heard it. The whispers weren't around him anymore. They were inside him. Hundreds of voices, tangled, broken, crying, laughing, whispering his name, their sounds clawing at the back of his skull. His body jerked once, his eyes rolling up for a heartbeat, the world spinning sideways. The thing's long, faceless head tilted toward him, and the hum grew louder like a church organ played under the ground. The widow smiled faintly. "This is the moment," she whispered. "The house will open, and it will keep you." The floor beneath Elijah's knees began to crack, slowly, softly, as if something beneath was pushing up. The black smoke seeped through those cracks. Not from the mirror this time, but from the ground itself. From under the floorboards that had been soaked with blood and time for years. The boards groaned like something alive was waking beneath them. Elijah's body shook harder. The voices grew louder, overlapping until they weren't words anymore. Just a wave of noise breaking inside his skull. The creature bent down, lowering its faceless head until it hovered inches from Elijah's face. He could feel the cold pouring off it like winter air trapped inside a tomb. Its hand, or whatever passed for a hand, reached forward slowly. When it touched his chest, it didn't feel like skin meeting skin. It felt like someone had reached inside him, like it had pressed a finger against his heart itself. He convulsed, choking on breath that wouldn't come, the smoke rushing inside his mouth like it had found its way home. His vision blurred. The edges of the room stretched and bent. The mirror was no longer behind the widow. It was everywhere. The room was melting into it. He could see faces in the gold cracks now. Dozens of faces, men, women, children. Their mouths opened and closed, whispering soundless words. The widow knelt beside him, her silk pooling around her like a black tide, her hand resting on his cheek. Her voice was calm. "You're part of it now," she said softly, like a lover's promise. "The house doesn't take bodies, Elijah. It takes souls." The creature pressed harder against his chest and his heartbeat shattered like glass in his ears. He saw nothing but the golden cracks. The room faded, the door, the portraits, the floor. All of it disappeared into that black and gold pulse. The last thing he felt was the widow's cold breath against his ear as she whispered, "Welcome home." The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes when the world sleeps, but the kind that comes when the world has already ended. The creature pulled back slowly, its arm soaked in something that wasn't blood. The widow stood again, calm and untouched. and the smoke that had wrapped around Elijah sank into the floor, the mirror, the walls. On the rug near the door lay Elijah's shoes, neatly placed where they had been taken off. His body was gone. Not dragged, not lifted, just gone. The air in the room grew still again like nothing had happened. The mirror was whole once more. No cracks, no gold, no shadow. Just a cold, perfect reflection of an empty room. The widow walked to the window, her black silk swaying gently with her steps, and looked out at the sleeping fields, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, like someone who had finally eaten after a long fast. Behind her, the house whispered one last time, a low, satisfied hum that came from everywhere and nowhere. Another name added to the walls no one saw, another voice in the chorus beneath the floor. Elijah was gone and the house was full again. For now. The night after Elijah vanished was too quiet, the kind of silence that didn't belong to the world outside but to the house itself, as if the Lockwood plantation had swallowed every sound whole and left the land listening to its own heartbeat. The fields lay flat under the silver moonlight. The crickets stopped singing, and even the wind seemed afraid to move through the trees. Back in the quarters, the people didn't sleep. They sat huddled in the shadows of the cabins, eyes fixed on the big house on the hill. The golden lantern still burned in its windows, flickering like eyes that never blinked, and every soul down there knew what that meant. Another one had been taken. No one said Elijah's name. Not out loud, because names had weight here. Names had a way of clinging to the house's walls, and those who spoke the name of the chosen too soon were said to hear whispers for the rest of their lives. Mothers kept their children close. Men avoided looking at the hill. It was always like this after the widow gave her reward. The next morning there would be no body, no grave, no explanation. Just an empty bed, and the house looking the same as it always had. Inside, the widow sat by her window with her hands folded in her lap, the silk of her black dress catching the faint gold of the oil lamp beside her. She stared at the oak trees outside, but her eyes weren't seeing them. Her lips were curved in that soft, quiet smile that had no warmth, only satisfaction. Somewhere deep in the house, the low hum returned, a sound like wind trapped inside the walls. Like breath beneath the floorboards, it wasn't loud, but it filled everything. It vibrated through the floor, through the beams, through her chest like a heartbeat that didn't belong to her. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. The house had eaten. The mirror in her room stood whole again, flawless, not a single crack left, but if anyone looked closely enough, they'd see something faint, like shapes shifting under ice. The surface was black and gold in places, catching the light and holding it in ways glass shouldn't. In that black, Elijah's face flickered for half a heartbeat. Not screaming, not moving, just there, then gone. Downstairs, the butler polished silver at the table, pretending not to hear the faint humming in the walls. He'd worked in this house for decades. He knew better than to ask questions. He knew better than to speak of the ones who disappeared. He knew the widow wasn't just a woman, not anymore. She belonged to the house. Or maybe the house belonged to her. By now there was no difference. At sunrise, the overseer found Elijah's shoes still sitting neatly by the door, exactly where he had left them, clean. Untouched by the mud of the fields, the air around them was cold. Colder than the morning wind, he didn't touch them. No one ever touched the shoes of the taken. He walked away with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the ground. Because the worst thing you could do here was look too long at the house. The house always looked back. That evening, the slaves gathered near the edge of the quarters, their whispers moving through the air like dry leaves, soft but sharp. Some said Elijah had been freed. Some said the widow had hidden him. But most didn't lie to themselves. They knew where he'd gone. The house kept everything it took. Some swore that late at night, when the wind hit the boards just right, they could hear footsteps walking under the floor, barefoot, steady and slow. Inside the widow's room, the mirror began to fog from the inside, a thin mist spreading across its surface. The widow rose from her chair, her movement smooth and soundless, and walked toward it. The glass pulsed faintly like something breathing beneath it. She lifted her hand and pressed her palm against the cold surface. It answered her. A faint whisper slid through the room like a single word carried on the wind. Her smile widened just enough to show teeth. The house knew hunger. It always had. It had fed on this land since before her time. She had only made herself its keeper. The men she called into her room were never chosen at random. The house liked strength. It liked the ones who still had a heartbeat worth taking. Elijah had been strong. Now he was part of it. That night, as the sky darkened again, the hum returned, louder than before. The floorboards shivered softly as though something deep inside the foundation was shifting, moving, growing. The widow walked through the halls barefoot, the wood cold beneath her feet, the shadows clinging to the hem of her dress like smoke. When she passed by the portraits, the painted eyes seemed to follow her, not because they were alive, but because the house itself watched through them. She stopped at the bottom of the staircase and whispered something low. A single phrase in the same language she had spoken the night Elijah vanished. The house answered. The mirrors on the walls trembled faintly, a soft ripple spreading across their surface. It was never satisfied for long. It would want another soon. Out in the quarters, a wind rose without warning, sweeping through the cabins, rattling the wood, sending a chill down every spine. The people didn't look up. They didn't need to. They knew what that wind meant. The house was awake again. The widow stood at her window once more, watching the fields, the oak trees swaying softly in the darkness. Behind her, the mirror whispered, faint and slow, like something turning in its sleep. Her eyes softened in the candlelight, but there was no kindness there, only hunger dressed in human skin. And as the lanterns burned low and the night settled into its blackest hour, Elijah's voice joined the chorus beneath the floor, whispering like all the others before him. Trapped in the bones of the house, feeding it, keeping it alive. The plantation would stay quiet. The fields would stay still. But the house would never stop waiting for the next name. It always waited. It always fed. And the widow always smiled.